Churches will want to make people feel comfortable. And the things that they teach oftentimes are meant to draw people in, but made it too easy. Made it too easy. If you are a follower of Jesus, your life is not your own. I don't know if you realize that decision, but your life is not your own. So for teachers and pastors to say, oh, why don't you give some of your time and your energy and your life to God? And what I want to correct, thank you, I want to correct is that your time, your energy, your life is not yours to give. It belongs to God already. When you said, I'll be a follower of Jesus Christ, the church has made it too easy. For Jesus made it hard. He made it hard to follow. We've been sold a lie. Oh, just give some of your money. Your money, that's not your money. Give some of your time. That's not your time. Give some of your life. That's not your life. When you decide to follow Jesus, you decide to pick up your cross. You know what that means? You pick up the electric chair. You pick up the shot that puts you to sleep. That's what that, in modern terms, that's what that means. Radical, right? That's the Bible. Radical. So if we've been taught wrong, we will always think of Christianity like a cruise ship instead of a battleship. And when you're on a cruise ship, you expect to be fed, nice meals, catered to. You expect to have a nice bed, maybe a window view of your room. And then when you wake up, you expect to lounge around the pool, go to places that you can visit. But when you're on a battleship, what happens? There's an alarm, goes off. You got to get up and get to work. You don't complain about your meal. You're worried about people shooting at you. You're worrying that you're going into enemy territory. It's a different mindset, completely different. And the church has sold you this idea that Christianity is going to fulfill all your needs. And it's going to be easy and peaceful, right? Like a cruise ship. It's not true. So if you expect that, you're going to be very disappointed. Okay? So we're not giving to God. No. As a follower of Jesus, you've already given your life to God. Okay? So in Romans 12:1, like I said, Paul said, this is your blank, Paul said that we are to give ourselves as a living sacrifice. A living sacrifice. This is the Bible. That's what worship is. I think I offended some people at Jesus Center last time I preached because I said, if someone tells you, just give your whole heart here at the altar during the songs, like that's not worship. Tell me where in the Bible it says worship equals singing. Worship is a living sacrifice. That means you give your whole life as a sacrifice. You know what sacrifice is? Death. Not very good for the skin. Death. Right? Let me turn to Galatians chapter 2, verses 18 through 20. For if I rebuild what I have once destroyed, and he's talking about the law, okay, the Old Testament law, because what happened in Galatians is that they came and they taught the Galatian church what the gospel was, okay? And they were going along just fine, and some other people came and said, no, you have to be a Jew first and then become a Christian, which means you have to get under the law and then you can be saved. But that's not the gospel. The gospel brings freedom, not more bondage. So he's saying, for if I rebuild what I have once destroyed, meaning the law, I prove myself to be a transgressor. For through the law I died to the law, so that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ. What does that mean to be crucified with Christ? Death. And it is no longer I who live. It's no longer I who live. So I'm not looking to myself for this life anymore. I died with Christ. It's no longer I who live. But Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me. So we were crucified with Christ. We no longer live, but Christ lives in us. So sometimes we think this, okay, I'm going to go back to the law. Why would we do that? Well, oftentimes we don't want to die. So we go back to, let me act spiritual so that God will at least be pleased with me. That's the law. Let me do spiritual things. But what does he want? Does he want spiritual exercises? No, he wants obedience. Sometimes the obedience, what we feel God's calling us to do, is too hard, so we go back to Egypt, back to the law. Well, it's easier to do things I know about, and I can do those things part-time because what he's asking me to do, I mean, come on, that's a little crazy, right? Die. I have been crucified with Christ, no longer I who live. See, this is the gospel. Chapter 3 is about my life belongs to another. It's a different way to think. But it's a biblical way to think. And you can tell me after class or study and tell me next week, no, Pastor Joe, you're wrong. You don't have to really die. But hey, this is what the Bible says. And we are to be like Jesus, go after Jesus, and that's what he did. Right? So there's some blanks in there. I've been crucified with Christ. No longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. Let me ask you a question. Why is Jesus a hero? How would you answer that? Why is Jesus? Jesus is our hero. Why is he a hero? Just shout it out. Laid down his life. Conquered death. He what? He laid his life down.
He
endured the cross.
the
suffering.
rejection and bullying.
Perfect love. What was that back there?
The epitome of selflessness.
The epitome of selflessness.
He obeyed God.
He obeyed God. These are all reasons why Jesus is our hero, right? It's amazing that, you know, all the movies that are out there are not necessarily Christian movies, but if you look at the typical movie, who is the hero in a typical movie? It's the person who sacrifices themselves to save others. And who is the villain in almost every movie? The selfish person who has an agenda to meet their own needs. Isn't that interesting? It's all in Hollywood. If you want to be the hero, lay your life down, because no one ever remembers a selfish person. They remember people who love well, who give their lives. You know, I think of people like Abraham Lincoln. He didn't have to do that, but he gave his life to try to unify a country. You know? William Wilberforce, he didn't have to spend years and years and years trying to abolish slavery, but he did. He gave his life. That was not selfish. That was selfless. These are the heroes in movies. These are the heroes in life. Those that give their lives for someone else, for a body of people, for another person, give their life, like actually sacrifice their life for a bigger cause. And so I want to tell you, if you live biblically, you're never going to regret that. You won't. If you give your life for someone else or a group of people, you will never regret that in heaven. Because these are the things that heaven esteems. These are the things heaven esteems. And sometimes we're taught as kids wisdom. Oh no, you don't want to do that. You don't want to move to another country and become a missionary. That's dangerous over there, right? I remember one of my kids was like, I don't know, 10 or 8 or 10 or something, said, God told me to buy this person an Apple Watch. And it was like all their money, like $300. And Andre and I were like, oh gosh, he's been saving that money. That's for him. We wanted him to be blessed, But of course, at the end of the day, it's like, go for it. If God told you to do that, go for it. What if he didn't hear God? So what? If you don't think God's going to reward you for thinking you heard him and doing something like that, go for it. Waste your life for someone else. That's what Jesus did. But yet, oh no, we don't want, that's not wisdom. That's not wisdom, right? Jesus was a hero because he gave his life. Jesus' wisdom, there's two kinds of wisdom. Jesus' wisdom from heaven led him to die. Jesus' wisdom from heaven led him to die. And we're going to talk about Peter, okay? Because Jesus talks about Peter. Do you remember when Peter was telling him, oh, Jesus, may it never be. You're not going to die. We will protect you, right? And what did Jesus say? Harsh words from a friend. Get behind me, Satan. Oh my gosh. Imagine hearing that from someone you just adore. A mentor, a spiritual father, spiritual mother. Get behind me, Satan. You're like, ouch. What does he mean by that? Wow. Get behind me. And he says, you are a stumbling block to me. Why? For you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's. And it's interesting, in the Greek, there's the word interests is not in there. And it's basically, the original language is, you do not have God's thinking, but man's way of thinking. You get that? You're thinking the way man does. And what did that lead Peter to do? Well, Peter's wisdom from hell led him to save himself. Where do I get that? We want to save Jesus, but also he was willing to lie to save himself. He ran when the guards all captured Jesus. The disciples ran away. Why? Save yourself. Here's this guy who's served them day in and day out, and yet it's like, save yourself all of a sudden, and lie so that no one knows I'm with Jesus, right? That was his wisdom. Where does that wisdom come from? Well, if we look at James chapter 3, verses 13 through 17, who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, Do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, even demonic. You see that? That's what Jesus was talking about when he addressed Peter. This type of thinking is demonic. It comes from hell. It comes from the kingdom of darkness. This type of thinking. And so we've all been duped with this demonic type of thinking. Save yourself. That's not from heaven. That's not wisdom from heaven. Save yourself. Do whatever you can to save yourself. Verse 16. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder in every evil thing. Disorder. When you see the fruit of disorder, then you can trace it back to jealousy and selfish ambition. When you see a group at a workplace, a group at church, even a family that's in disorder, you can trace it back to this type of demonic thinking. Save yourself. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits. When someone's being mean to you and you feel like you need to protect yourself, you don't want to be merciful. You don't want to give any more than they've already taken, right? So what happens? What comes over you? Fear. And that fear says, save yourself. Okay? Good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. Peter's wisdom was from the kingdom of darkness. It was meant to keep Jesus from giving his life, which Jesus knew this was the will of the Father. I'm going to die. And that same wisdom caused Peter to run and lie and to stay alive. But after transformed, Peter, he did die in a similar way. The similar way of Jesus. He was crucified. That's the difference between the spirit of fear and selfish ambition and then the Spirit of God, which came upon him. He was baptized by fire. And he became a different person. Right? And they were going to crucify Peter, and he said, I am not worthy to die like my Lord. So they crucified him upside down, according to history. Amazing, right? Discipleship is costly. In Matthew 16:24, this is right after this interaction with Peter. Jesus says to his disciples, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself. Deny himself. How many of us do that on a regular basis? How many of us wake up and say, today I'm going to deny myself? It is my goal to put myself last. Deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Take up his cross. That's such a violent image right there. But he says, if anyone wishes to come after me, do we consider ourselves followers of Jesus? To deny himself, take up his cross, follow me. Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then repay every man according to his deeds. It's a different type of living. And I'm getting into chapter 4 because they come together. Chapter 4 is self-protection is contrary to love. Self-protection is contrary to love. We're all called to love. But what happens a lot of times when we interact and we try to love, we end up saying, I need to protect myself. Because love hurts. Did it hurt Jesus? Love hurts. And a lot of times we'll love as long as it's reciprocal, but when it begins to hurt, we give up. I'm just saying, generally speaking, you may be different, but that's just me. When love begins to hurt, we tend to give up. When someone's not worth it, we tend to give up. Well, however we define that, right? But Jesus loved until it hurt so much, even to the point of death. That was his love. His greatest act of love was on the cross for us. That was him loving us, right? Let me ask you a question. How do you go about choosing a church? Would it be more like Jesus to pick a church with great leadership, a powerful worship team, excellent ministries? Or would it be more like Jesus to pick a church that needs help in all those areas? It's like the Sunday school teacher that said, okay, kids, what is small and furry and gray and likes to eat acorns or nuts? It's in the park. And they're all like, come on, you know it. It's just a little animal. You see it at Wilson Park, you know. And they're just like, they won't answer. And one kid finally raised his hand and said, I know the answer is Jesus, but it sure seems like a squirrel. I don't want you to give me the right answer. How do you go about picking a church? You go to the one that needs you the most? Loves you the most?
No, just love.
Loves?
We went to the one that we prayed for. I said, God, where do you want us? He said, here.
That's good. God, where do you want us? He said here. That's amazing. I'm just trying to challenge you. Because if you really live out this gospel, it's different. It's different than you think. It's not, you know, and you approach things like picking a church, picking a job, picking where to live, right? Picking a spouse. You see things differently when you begin to take these things seriously, like deny yourself, pick up your cross. And then you start to say, well, how can I be a blessing? Instead of, what can I get out of this relationship? What can I get out of this organization? What can I get? But God, how can I serve you best? Where do you want me? Where do you want me to live? Who do you want me to befriend? Who do you want me to hang out with? How can I help? Right? Isn't it different? Completely different. And, you know, we can all confess that we haven't always thought that way. And so it means something when you say, I want to be more like Jesus. I love the testimonies. I love the miracles. I love when God uses me. I love all those things. But this has got to be the foundation for all that stuff. And if this is not the foundation, Jesus, out of his love and mercy for you, may not raise you up in that way. It could destroy you. Right? This has to be the foundation. The foundation must be, and we see it in 1 Corinthians 13, it must be love. It must be service. It must be God's will. I want your will, God. What can I do for you? How can I make your dreams come true? And then it's easy for God to do all those other things. But this foundation is a little bit more difficult to get inside of us, to transform our minds so we actually think this way. It isn't trying to think this way. It's like, I want my mind to be renewed so I actually think this way. I approach a situation, oh man, this is going to be really hard, and they need a lot of help. Yeah, God, is this what you want me to do? Is this where you want me? I mean, I could be the most good here. It's a lot different, right? It's a different type of wisdom. So getting back to Romans chapter 12. Romans 12, 1 and 2. Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God. So the motivation here, as Paul is urging us, he's saying the motivation is the mercies of God. So when you decide, I'm going to give my life, you're looking back at all that Jesus did for you. That's the motivation. Jesus came to earth. He died for me. He forgave me. He's offering me new life, eternity with him, because of all those mercies. Like, wow, God. Because of all those mercies, with that motivation, says to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice. A sacrifice. They knew this language very well. In fact, all religions did. It was when they burned an animal, and some religions, humans, on the altar. That animal died. But he's not saying, I want you to cease to exist. He's saying, I want you to be a living sacrifice. It's kind of like a couple's at counseling, and the man says, I would die for my wife. And the counselor says, why don't you try living for her first? The problem with living sacrifices is they tend to wiggle off the altar. You give a commitment, and then it gets too hard, and you look this way and you look that way, and you take off. This fire's getting too hot. It's actually burning my flesh. It's burning my flesh. It's a good thing, if depending on your goal. If you want to be more like Jesus, you want your flesh to burn. Acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. This is how worship is defined in the New Testament. And so when I said at Jesus Center too, and I'll say here, if the pastor comes and says, give your whole life at the altar right now while we're singing these songs, and all these songs are tricking us into giving our hearts in that moment. The music is so good, and everyone's, like going for it. I want to go for it too. On Monday morning, that's when worship really starts. It's not the singing. I love praise, and it is biblical to praise and dance and shout and all those things because God is so good. But the idea of worship is found right here on Monday morning when you say, okay, God, what do you want me to do today? When you're going to work and you sit at your desk and you say, okay, God, who do you want me to talk to today? Right? That's worship. That's offering your body as a living sacrifice. Dying to yourself. Listen, in Romans chapter 8, it talks a lot about the resurrection life. But you can't get to the resurrection life if you don't die first. In Romans chapter 6, it says, don't you know that all of you have been baptized into his death? In fact, let me turn there. This is so good. Romans chapter 6. 6 verse 4, therefore we have been buried with him through baptism into death, so that, as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life. For if we become united with him in the likeness of his death, certainly we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. And so many of us want the resurrection power without the death. But we got to truly die. We got to truly die to that old man. Die to self. Say, I'm not living for me anymore. I belong to another. I've been bought with a price. When I became a follower of Jesus, I'm saying, I'm following you. I'm not following myself anymore. Not my will, but your will be done. That actually, it takes on a whole different life. It's not a confession at the altar without the lifestyle. That confession has to have the action built with it. And that only happens when we renew our minds to think this way. Do we think in a way where we wake up and we're like, my life is not my own? And it doesn't matter what everyone else is doing. I'm set on accomplishing his will. Because that's what Jesus' mind was set on. His food was to do the will of his Father, right? Do we think this way? Sometimes. I think this way sometimes. Sometimes I don't. But I want to grow in that. I want to grow in this idea of that I'm losing my life. Those who lose your lives will find it. Right? I'm not sure what that totally means. But it means you're set in a direction. And that direction looks a lot different than the world's ways. And that thinking is a lot different than how we've been living up to this point. And you say, man, Pastor Wright, I'm so thankful for what Jesus has done for me, but I just let me come to church and kick back and, That's not the Bible. The Bible doesn't say give your life to Jesus and then go kick back. I wish I could tell you something different. But one thing that I do know, when you truly set out to sacrifice yourself, you will taste glory. You will taste that sweet resurrection power in your life. When you set your sights on being last, you will see how God will raise you up to first. So many times. You will not regret ever serving the Lord. And I'm not talking about serving people necessarily. Do you understand? There's a big difference. When you serve the Lord, oftentimes it results in serving people. I'm not saying that because that's what the Lord calls us to. But when you set your heart out to serve and please people, it never turns out well. Okay? When you serve people for the sake of serving people, a lot of times what they want you to do isn't the best thing for them. God knows. God knows what the best thing is for them. God knows who he wants to touch. There are people on God's heart. And it's God's will is the perfect will. Right? So, for your before I get into discussion questions, anyone have any questions for me? I'll try to answer. Any questions on this topic? Yeah.
So you said that you have to die, and I don't know, I feel like I hear that a lot, but like, how would you apply that to yourself? Like, of course, it's not like a one size fits all, but like,
How would you go about dying? So, Clara says she hears that a lot, but what are the practical steps? That's just a great question. So, it happens not like a one size fits all. It doesn't happen in one moment. It happens in multiple moments when every decision becomes now, okay, this is what I want, but God, what do you want? That's the practical step of dying to self over and over and over. Is every situation, every decision, I know what I want. And I feel like that's a really good thing to process with God. Tell him what you want. That's great. Tell him, this would be my dream, right? But what do you want? And that's the definition of dying to yourself. Does that make sense? When you make when you make that final decision and it's based on what you believe, God, I say believe, because sometimes we don't hear it totally clearly. I praise God for all of you who do hear totally clearly, but we're trying our best to hear God's will, right? And we hear it from the Bible, we hear it from Him, but when you make that decision where you're saying, you know what, I want something, but God's will is different, I'm going to do what He wants, that's dying to self and living for God. That's putting yourself last and putting His will first. And that's just decision after decision, day after day.
Can I give an example, maybe?
Sure. Let me get this question first. Oh, wait. Someone else's hand was up. Yeah.
So in the Bible, Jesus talks about how his burden is light. Can you like explain that? Because I feel like that doesn't really make sense to me in the context of this. So could you just like explain like what he was talking about when he said that?
Yeah. His burden is light. And Lorelai is saying this doesn't make sense. It seems pretty heavy and pretty to die all the time. And Jesus is like, oh yeah, it's light, right? So this is what happens when you live for yourself or to please others or riches or glory, whatever the world's ways. You're gonna bring on heavy weights and bondages. And this is the thing that is so deceptive about the world's ways. Satan promises you, come this way. Oh, you'll be free. Oh, you'll be fulfilled. Oh, you'll be whatever, right? But God's not going to tell you to do something that's bad for you. And let me tell you this. He values in priority your soul much more than your body. Okay, so it doesn't mean you're not going to go into physical danger, but and so you get all these burdens. Anyway, when you give all this over and you truly release it and serve God, you're going to feel the most freedom than any other way of life. And Jesus knows that. God knows that. And so this is the pathway to a life of freedom. And a life where, when you take on my burden, my yoke, you see, a yoke is when you have two oxen, right? And the yoke went over their shoulders and they pulled the plow, right? And so that means work. And so those yokes are heavy. And so they're pulling this thing, and the oxen are like feeling the stress of this thing day in and day out. And so he makes a comparison. He says, if you put on my yoke, meaning what the work that I have for you. You see, when you see minister of the gospel, and maybe you know someone who's just totally sold out, and you're like, but what they're doing is hard. But they're not feeling like it's hard because they're doing it for Jesus and with Jesus. They feel freedom. It's just the way it works out. God knows what's best for us. You put on the world's ways, it'll burden you down heavier and heavier and heavier. Yeah.
You know, I love how Brian Simmons put this in verse 1. And he writes, I encourage you to surrender yourselves to God. I encourage you to surrender yourselves to God, to be His sacred living sacrifice, and live in holiness, experiencing all that delights his heart. For this becomes your genuine expression of worship.
Ooh, that's good.
And I think, yeah, I just think that the way Brian describes that, it's just such an exciting thing to do. God will capture your heart, and you'll be overwhelmed by his love. He writes here that experiencing all the delights of God's heart.
That's good.
Yeah.
So the enemy likes to trick us and say, hey, listen, if you get all this stuff, you're going to be fulfilled. But it's not true. You see people who have nothing living for God, and they are free and joyful, and you get to experience more and more of him. You want to share your example?
Really quick. Can you remind me the question? Your question?
Yeah, sure. I said, how do you die to yourself?
Or die to yourself. I was thinking of an example. Like when a parent comes and asks you to do something that you don't like. For example, do the dishes. And instead of saying, no, I don't want to do that. Oops. So just go do it, because that's a living sacrifice. In obedience, without, just, okay, Mom, inside, God knows that you don't like doing it. We don't like doing it, but you do it because that's a sacrifice that you're doing for the Lord, and then for your parents in this case, or somebody who asks you to do something that we don't like.
That's
right?
good. Yeah. Hold on a sec. So I want to get to the questions. Now, is it going to all of a sudden make the dishes fun? No. Is it going to make laundry exciting? No. That's not the point. What makes it fun, what makes it exciting, is that you're doing his will. Okay? So all of a sudden dishes become something meaningful and purposeful because you're pleasing his heart. That's the greatest thing in life is when you feel the Father proud of you. I'm telling you. That's it. You can live for that forever, right? And so, do I live for doing dishes? No. But if God says, I want you to do that, and you're saying, I want to accomplish your will, and he beams down on you, so proud of you, son. It's like, wow, the dishes, they weren't so bad after all. I just, love this amazing feeling of God's pleasure over my life.
But what is his will
Right?
at the moment? The dishes or obedience?
Obedience.
Obedience.
Obedience, of course. He doesn't want sacrifice
That's the
more than obedience. Okay, I want to get to the questions. So we have a couple discussion questions. The first one is, what does it mean to sacrifice yourself in Romans 12? And these were things we talked about, but maybe each one of you has a different insight or example, or you want to talk about it a little bit, and it really benefits the rest of the group, right? And then the second question is, what are some examples of the wisdom that would keep you from sacrificing yourself? I want you to give examples of some of the things that you think about when you say, I'm going to sacrifice myself for the Lord. And you think of things that keep you from doing that, right? Things that are practical, like, well, of course I wouldn't. I can't quit my job. Or of course I can't do this or I can't do that. What are those things? And it doesn't have to be a right answer, but just discuss that, right? In the chapter you're going to read this week, it talks about this young missionary girl. We read this book years ago, but there's a quote from her, and her parents were like, how could you go to Africa? There's dangers there. There's diseases. There's famine. There's war. There's all these things. Aren't you worried about that? And she actually said at 18 years old, she said, I am more worried, and it's more dangerous for me in this comfortable location of apathy to lose my fire for Jesus. That is more dangerous than going and getting killed in Africa. Isn't that amazing? Powerful. So what are some of the wisdom things that you go through in your own head, or maybe other people have told you, well, you can't live that radical. That's not wisdom. You kind of just discuss that among your table. That's the second question, okay? And then we'll wrap up at 8:50. Okay, go.